before Wes Huff single-handedly took down the Billy Carson empire.
I have a facsimile, so I have a photocopy.
Great shot, kid. That was 1 in a million.
Before he misinformed Joe Rogan about the Dead Sea Scrolls.
It was word for word identical to the Masoretic text.
Word for word.
Word for word.
Wow.
Wes Huff spent last summer slumming it on small-time podcasts.
All the way from the Great White North, our good friend and colleague, Wesley Huff.
Moranis.
Yeah. Remember that?
Remember that?
Yeah.
That was awesome.
To respond to gospel authorship videos from a small-time YouTuber.
Counter apologists, I guess that may be the right name, Paulogia, on this question of who authored the Gospels. Do we have actual reliable attributions?
Can they really call themselves Christian apologists if they pronounce my name correctly?
But who actually wrote the Gospels? How do we know? These are anonymous books, entirely without attribution.
There's actual, reason to argue that, in the sense that if you remove the gospel heading and then you just read the text, could you figure out who the author was? Well, you really couldn't necessarily, or you wouldn't come up with the names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John necessarily.
Welcome to Apologia, where a former Christian takes a look at the claims of Christians. And today is one of those wonderful days where I'm joined by a Christian, New Testament professor Dr. Hugo Méndez.
Yeah, I identify as Greek Catholic, but everything is so much more complicated when it comes to the kind of scholarship that we do.
And the kind of scholarship you do is most impressive, starting with a PhD from Yale.
PhD from the University of Georgia, but my first teaching position was at Yale Divinity School
very
for
good.
2 years.
And the actual Yale, not like Yale, British Columbia.
Yeah, that's right. Yale University, New Haven, Connecticut.
We've had some apologists who sometimes make some weird distinctions, so we got to check on that.
If I'm going to do what I was taught at Oxford.
Yeah, right. So I'm an associate professor of religious studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I teach New Testament and early Christianity here.
And Hugo speaks an absurd number of languages.
I am fluent in 6 million forms of communication. This signal is not used by the Alliance.
Have you done a count?
Oh, no, I can't say I've done a count. I did a PhD in historical linguistics. So, I kind of have an interesting trajectory relative to most New Testament scholars in the sense that my training was actually in a different field. And I transitioned into this field. My dissertation had worked on gospel translations, and that was kind of my entryway.
And while many people like me have been using this garbage 7th edition of this book,
Yeah. So I co-authored the New Testament, A Historical Introduction to the Early Christian Writings. The first 7 editions were Bart Ehrman. With the 8th edition now, I'm the second author, which is kind of this passing the baton sort of situation. We still work together on it. And it's the #1 best-selling textbook in the United States for the New Testament in higher ed. So if you take an introductory New Testament course at any of these major universities, you're very likely using this book. Smaller universities, you're likely using this book.
and if you're not at a university, but wish you could take that class, well, you're in luck because
I'm teaching a 27 lecture course through the Bart Ehrman Biblical Studies Academy, specifically on the New Testament. We call it Exploring the Christian Bible, in which in 27 lessons, we'll be going through the entire New Testament canon, and you'll be getting the same class that I give to my undergraduates at UNC.
it's a course I'm going to be taking. It's actually a ridiculously good deal for a university level course, which you can check out at tinyurl.com/HugoNT for Hugo New Testament. We'll talk more about that later because people are here for you to respond to Christian apologist debate champion Wes Huff.
So this is Wes Huff giving us the lowdown on where the Gospel of John comes from.
Correct. So the way you've heard the name Wes Huff before?
I've seen his name around. Can you, just for our purposes right here, if it's okay,
Sure.
Paul? So give me his background, because I'm not.
Yeah, sure. So Wes is a PhD student at the University of Toronto and a member of an organization called Apologetics Canada,
Okay.
who shot into prominence when he debated a gentleman named Billy Carson, who promotes some out there ideas about ancient civilizations and aliens.
Friday Night History Channel. Yeah.
Exactly. Billy was, in fact, on the History Channel and the Discovery Channel, all that.
Okay, yeah.
So Wes did what any manuscript student could do, and that's point out that Codex Sinaiticus did indeed affirm that Jesus was crucified and that Billy's other sources are late forgeries. But he did it well and with style. So that landed Wes on the Joe Rogan podcast.
Gotcha.
Which is why you're seeing him everywhere. because
Everywhere,
he-
the amplification began. And
Right.
that was the P52 fragment. I think that's the one thing
Yes,
that I saw
that's
flash
correct.
on my
Yeah.
newsfeed. Okay.
I made something for you.
Ooh.
So this guy is P52. John Rylands 457.
I'm glad your sphere exists that you don't have to know who S. Huff is. But that's
beautiful, gentle innocence that I retain.
Correct.
Yeah.
That's right.
There's a lot of consensus that an individual named Johannes, John, wrote the Gospel of John. But the question is that the disciple John? The early church writings ascribe an individual named John the Elder. Is that the same person?
Absolutely not. We do not. Yeah, no. So I watched that Wes Huff recent interview, over this question, and that's not where scholarship stands. So we know that the gospel has the title John affixed to it from a very early point. With the dating of ancient manuscripts, there's a lot of questions about when our earliest text of John is and when we should be able to date it. But suffice it to say, it is a very early tradition that this text was called John, but we really do not know who this author is. The text itself never identifies its author. It is an anonymous text. And in the case of this particular tradition, there are reasons for doubting, in particular, that, for instance, a figure named John actually wrote this gospel.
And then you have the disciple whom Jesus loved, continually mentioned throughout the Gospels. And so that's clearly the source information of the main eyewitness of where this material is coming from is this particular disciple.
Yeah, so the gospel wants you to think that it comes from a disciple whom Jesus loved. It sets out this character. He's supposed to be the most intimate disciple of Jesus's, his closest follower, his most faithful follower. He's there with him at the crucifixion. He's the first person in the empty tomb. The reality for us as scholars is that we're not sure that he existed. And if he did exist, we're not sure he has the characteristics that the Gospel of John attributes to him. So on the one hand, there are scholars, and many of them are conservative scholars, some of them are centrist scholars, who believe that there really is a disciple whom Jesus loved, and they would identify that disciple with perhaps John the Apostle, son of Zebedee. They might identify him with other figures like Lazarus, etc., but they believe he existed. There's really a large mainstream of scholars that would think that this disciple might have existed in the past, but that he's being used in the gospel in different sorts of ways. He's, for instance, being given idealized attributes. His life is perhaps being exaggerated or worked over. He's being leveraged in particular to give the gospel eyewitness authority in ways that he probably wouldn't ultimately be really the reason to, kind of cite this for. There are other scholars, and I'm in this camp. This would also include David Litwa. This would also include Harry Attridge, who think that this character is simply an invented character. He's a literary character. He's a figure who has been invented for the gospel, either to support its eyewitness claims, as a device to draw readers in. There are different sorts of explanations, literary or historical, that one could imagine for inventing an eyewitness. What we do know is that this was done often in ancient literature, and it should not surprise us to see the Gospel of John doing it.
So who is this disciple? There are a number of options. I think part of the argumentation against it being the fisherman John is that there's certain levels of information internally the gospel that kind of show that the conversations that the author seems to have access to requires a level of social status that a fisherman would not have been able to get into those rooms. Now, you could get around that by saying that, well, John is likewise interviewing eyewitnesses, and that's how he's getting information. Right. That the source information doesn't have to necessarily be of one, particular line of evidence.
Yeah, so I think that John is working with earlier materials. I think that he has access to the synoptic gospels, that the author has access to the synoptic gospels. I'm in that camp. And this has been a kind of significant shift in biblical studies in the last 10 or 15 years of starting to see that John probably at least knew Mark, probably knew Matthew, probably had read a draft of, an actual copy of Luke. And that he's worked with those sources. He's an early Christian of some stripe. And so he has access to at least oral traditions and things that are floating in the air around him. But I think that it's very clear that the author is also doing things in his text that I think are closer to what we might call historical invention. Details that the gospel provides that are not those that we would expect for an eyewitness to give. We would expect for someone who is essentially attempting to present themselves as an eyewitness falsely. So if you look at the Gospel of John, you will see that Jesus utters lengthy discourses, extensive teachings that bear no resemblance on some very fundamental levels to his teachings in the synoptic gospels. In Mark, Matthew, and Luke, even though these gospels have differences, Jesus has a pretty clear core message. It's about the kingdom of God. It's about a future, judgment day. It's about all these sorts of pieces. And when you go to John, suddenly you find an entirely new landscape of emphases. Jesus, for instance, starts by talking about how one can become spirit within themselves. They become pneuma in Greek. He will say that he will dwell inside his disciples spiritually and they will dwell in him spiritually. This kind of participationist idea. He will say that through this indwelling, they will have access to celestial realms. This is a major emphasis of chapter 14. This is not present in the earlier gospels. And he is going to get very, very close to deification language in the gospel. This idea that humans take on divine attributes through this experience. This is an entire system of ideas that doesn't exist in earlier gospels. And yet Jesus in the Gospel of John hits on them chapter after chapter. If these were as central to Jesus's ministry and teachings as the Gospel of John shows, where are they in earlier Gospels? What feels more likely is that the Gospel of John is a text like Thomas, like Mary, like Judas, that imposes a brand new, rather second century philosophy, theology onto Jesus and co-opts him to be kind of the spokesperson for this theology. I think apologists can see this when Thomas and Mary and Judas are doing this. They don't want to see it when John is doing it.
I've heard you actually called John the first apocryphal gospel.
Yeah, that's right. In many ways, I think it can fit that label. If you look at the Gospel of John, there are these devices in there, and I'll talk about them in an upcoming book that's going to be published this summer with Oxford University Press, The Gospel of John, A New History. If you look very closely at this text, there are a lot of the motifs you find in apocryphal gospels. Jesus is a cryptic teacher in Thomas. He's a cryptic teacher in John. There's this notion in John that the disciples will have forgotten certain teachings of Jesus, but that they will be supernaturally recovered by them, which is the perfect vehicle for an author who wants to explain why certain teachings are not being widely proclaimed in Christianity that he is trying to introduce into a text. The gospel will also present itself as the work of an eyewitness, but an eyewitness is unlikely to have written it, fundamentally because its portrait of Jesus is so dramatically different from what came before in Jesus' tradition. If the Jesus of the Gospel of John is radically unlike Matthew, Mark, and Luke on some very fundamental levels, you have to raise questions about whether or not that eyewitness claim is valid. One aspect that has made scholars skeptical of the eyewitness claims of John and of the existence of the beloved disciple in particular is the fact that in the scenes where the beloved disciple appears, if you turn to the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke, you will not find the beloved disciple there. So if you look at the crucifixion scene, there are the women standing under the cross in Mark, Matthew, and Luke. In John, it's the women and the disciple. If you turn to the Gospel of Luke, you'll see a scene where Peter runs to the tomb and goes into the tomb. No one's with him. If you go to the Gospel of John, there's Peter running to the tomb and the beloved disciple running with him who happens to have this very idealized response of belief. I call this the Forrest Gump effect. It feels as if the eyewitness has been inserted into scenes that appear in other Gospels, I think precisely to give this Gospel an eyewitness flair.
I love it. In my former comic and movie industries, we called that retcon. But that's
right. It's a retcon. There
was a theory that was developed, and then I think it was when I first heard about it was under Craig Evans, where the individual, the disciple whom Jesus loved, was being proposed as Lazarus, because the first time someone was described as being loved by Jesus in that way was when Jesus was going to raise Lazarus from the dead, and they came to him and said, the one whom you love has died.
Lazarus, for me, there are definitely people who have thrown out that hypothesis. Ben Witherington III is another person who has given that hypothesis. There's a very clear reason why it cannot be Lazarus. Lazarus, it's true, is said to have Jesus love him. He's one of the people that Jesus loves. This comes out in chapter 11. By the way, the same chapter also notes that he loves Mary and Martha. So before we run ahead of ourselves, we should recognize that Jesus loving people is apparently Lazarus's whole family, is apparently that entire chapter 11 thing. But more to the point, when the story ends and you get to about, chapter 12, you get to this story where it says that the chief priests are so upset about how the resurrection of Lazarus is essentially turning people to Jesus that they decide they're going to kill Lazarus. So I find it unthinkable that then in chapter 18, this other disciple, which again, chapter 20, verse 2 tells us is the disciple whom Jesus loved.
Right.
That this other disciple gets to waltz in to the home of the high priest, the chiefest of all the chief priests, that he's welcomed, invited, that this is actually normal and that he leaves totally unscathed. This doesn't fit what we know about Lazarus, which is he has a target on his back and the chief priests want to kill him, not months earlier, not years earlier, days earlier in the plot is when they hatch this plan. So yeah, no, I think this figure absolutely has to end up being someone other than Lazarus.
Nonetheless, whoever is writing the Gospel of John, his name is almost certainly John because of the evidence that we have based on that. And because the early church really doesn't ascribe it to anybody else.
Yeah, that's correct. In the sense that as far as our sources can take us, there is a very consistent tradition among early Christians that this gospel was written by John, the son of Zebedee in particular, though. And this is one of the issues that I have, for instance, with that Wes Huff interview, that Wes Huff, kind of works with the idea that it has to be someone named John, but that's not the early Christian tradition. It's John, the son of Zebedee in particular. So when scholars note the problems around John, the son of Zebedee, they are striking at the heart of that tradition much more directly. I think it's hard to kind of obfuscate. There are scholars today that have considered other Johns as possibility, and the one that gets a lot of attention is this figure who's mentioned in the writings of Papias named John the Elder. But there are absolutely no testimonies from ancient Christians that would suggest that this figure is the John for whom a Gospel of John is written.
Which is
you do have to at least say that the individual who wrote first of all, there's internally, I think there's some testimony. It's interesting that Peter mentions the transfiguration in his letter. It was something so big that it moved him. And in 1 John, we were eyewitnesses of his glory, right? The same kind of testimony. Yeah. And if you look at the transfiguration, there's only a few people there. So internally, there's some continuity for the traditional understanding of John as the author. Now,
so I find that problematic on different levels, right? We have 3 disciples who are present for the transfiguration. The other one is James. And we don't have a text that's attributed to James in the New Testament. We don't have anything like that would also give us that tradition, but that should leave open the question of which disciple are we looking at. Secondly, that pairing of Peter and John is really nice and neat if you're looking at the canonical New Testament we have today and have had, at least some of us, since the 4th century. It's not quite how that entire body of literature developed. I mean, there were canons in antiquity in the Middle Ages that lacked some of these texts. And so we're very much looking at it from a very different ways away perspective. Thirdly, I think I dispute the idea that 1 John mentions the transfiguration. It doesn't. He says he's seen, touched, and heard the word of life. That's what that says. That could have happened at any point over a very long period of time and probably happened every single day between these, the group of men that's traveling. If you think that the author here is positioning himself as an eyewitness to the life of Jesus, which I think he's doing falsely.
I'm not completely convinced First Peter mentions transfiguration either.
Yeah, but there's also the fact that, in the case of First Peter and First John, I mean, there are sound reasons for doubting the authorial claims of each. I mean, First Peter is a text that, look, you can go into the 9th century and you can find Syriac writers who are saying these letters might not be authentic.
Yeah, and I would argue personally for traditional authorship.
Yeah, so there are great reasons for thinking that this figure is not John, the son of Zebedee. So for one thing, you can kind of start with the global picture. This is a figure who is presented as an idealized disciple. He is faithful to Jesus until death. He will not leave him up and through the cross. He is present on the morning of the resurrection. The reality is that the Gospels that come before John, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, not just in the Bible, but chronologically speaking, present the disciples' part in a much more complex, nuanced light. They have individual faults and weaknesses. They are not so idealized like this disciple. A second issue that you have with the John, the son of Zebedee interpretation in particular is that We know quite a bit about what John the son of Zebedee experienced from other gospels. We know how he first encountered Jesus. He's sitting on a boat. Jesus calls him and his brother to follow me. They drop their nets. They go follow him. We know that he's present with Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration. We know that he's in the Garden of Gethsemane. If you look through the Gospel of John, none of these scenes appear. It would be really odd to think that this figure is the eyewitness who's giving you his particular testimony and happens to omit everything that happened to this particular figure that we know of. Another real problem that we have with John the son of Zebedee in particular is the fact that in John chapter 18, we're very clearly told that the other disciple who's with Peter, a figure that chapter 20 verse 2 is going to tell us is the disciple whom Jesus loved, the other disciple with Peter. It says that this figure is known to the high priest. So much so that when Jesus is interrogated by the high priest, this figure is allowed right into the interrogation space. This is not something we would expect for a figure who is a Galilean fisherman. When you look at even the entire accounts in the Synoptic Gospels, everyone is commenting on the fact that, for instance, Peter sounds like he's from nowhere here. All the people from Galilee are just country bumpkins from somewhere else. They're different from us. The idea that somehow this random Galilean fisherman has connections all the way to the top of the power structure of Judea completely bends imagination to the breaking point. You put these factors together, and there are sound reasons why scholars have doubted the identification of John the son of Zebedee through the centuries.
In my video the host was referencing, I point out,
In the 9th chapter of the first gospel, there is an account of Jesus meeting Matthew, who is traditionally considered the author of the book. However, instead of using his own words to describe this significant event in his life, Matthew simply copies the narrative nearly word for word from the author of the second gospel, who certainly was not present.
is this a parallel situation?
I wouldn't necessarily think of it as a parallel situation, also because, yet again, Mark and Matthew represent their own challenges. I think, we want to take cues from Luke a little bit. Luke goes ahead and his preface to his gospel says that he's received things that he's gotten from the eyewitnesses, like the other people who are writing gospels right now. That includes Mark and Matthew. I think that includes John as well. These are not direct eyewitnesses to the life of Jesus. They're taking individual traditions and ideas that they've heard, they're putting them together, synthesizing them, probably in the process inventing traditions as well. I think that's closer to what we have.
So I would say, based on the early church evidence, we know that John was the last living apostle. And actually, a late date for John comes from the early church, in that it says that he wrote close to his death, and that he was one of, if not the last apostle living. And so while late dating for the other gospels is actually, in spite of the early church testimony, late dating for John is actually because of the early church testimony. And I would say that's true. He's probably writing in the mid to late 90s.
I'll say when I went on his website, he put the Synoptic Gospels at 40s to 70s. So, just for starters, I'll note that he is not representing mainstream scholarship there in terms of placing the Gospels that wildly early. And I'll just say this, kind of right off the bat, I don't see a way to read the Gospel of Mark and think that author doesn't live after the destruction of the temple.
Right.
If you read the Gospel of Mark, you have an entire chapter that's virtually dedicated to the destruction of the temple as a theme. Jesus says, not one stone will be left upon another. This temple is going to be destroyed. It's like I tell my students, if you're publishing a book and you want to claim that, someone went ahead and predicted the fall of the World Trade Center in 2001, you probably are publishing it after 2001, because if you published it before, everyone can look at the World Trade Center, see it that it's still there, and think that you're a quack. All of the predictions that are invented about Nostradamus predicted the fall of the World Trade Center, I promise you, not one of them comes from before the year 2001. Similarly, if Mark is going to foreground this motif of the temple is destroyed and Jesus called it, he expects that his readers are going to be responsive to that, because they knew that the temple was destroyed. So we can start right there. That's why I think the Synoptic Gospels, at the very least, have to date after 70. But I generally think that the dating of the Gospel of John to the 90s, I think you could even spread that upward to the 110s. Somewhere in that 20-year range is about right, turn of the 2nd century. I think that's within the mainstream of scholarship.
And one of the reasons why the Gospel of John sounds so different is because he is at least aware of the content of the other Gospels that are floating around. Whether he knows the written source intimately is a different question. He may or may not have. But I think he's aware of the stories that are floating around. And so he knows he's probably the last living apostle. He knows that the apostolic witness is dying out and will die out with him. And so he proposes to write another gospel. He proposes to write another gospel that explains the rest of the story, and he's not going to repeat what everybody already knows. So he comes along and he says, hey, let me tell you the rest of the story as someone who was an eyewitness. Let me fill in some of the gaps here. And the reason why it sounds so different is because he's not interested in repeating what everyone else is already very well acquainted with. And so he fills out and he has a purpose, right? All of the gospel authors have a purpose in what they're writing. And so when John comes around, he's focusing on Jesus's claim to be Yahweh, the God of Israel, who has become human. And as God, he can do for us what we could never do for ourselves. Whereas the other gospels have different intentions in mind. Not that they're not focusing on Jesus being Yahweh, they certainly are. But John is coming in later, and he's really trying to hit that home for a particular reason. And he's not going to beat around the bush and repeat all the same stories that everybody else knows. And so personally, that's why I think it sounds so different.
It's a take that certain church fathers, certain early Christian writers had. I think they're all struggling with, why is John different? Why do we even have John if it's this different from the synoptics? And they're suggesting that, yeah, John is filling in the gaps chronologically, John is filling in the gaps theologically. I think that, in terms of just scholarly opinion today for the kind of mainstream of critical scholarship, there are great reasons for thinking that we need to at least nuance that view considerably. So it's very possible that the author of John, whoever he is looked at other gospels and has seen places where he could expand ideas. I think one thing that the author is probably struggling with is that the other gospels are presenting Jesus in a way that doesn't conform to his own particular ideology, which was probably shaped by influences including Hellenistic Jewish philosophy. I think these are, probable influences on the gospel writer of John. But in this case, his act of supplementation isn't necessarily one that gets you back to Jesus. The challenge that I would have, I think, to someone making that sort of argument is simply, how could the other gospels have missed something so central and vital to Jesus' tradition as the claim he's God, the entire idea that you're born as spirit, the entire idea that you experience this mutual indwelling with Jesus spiritually? How do they miss celestial? How do they miss all of these themes that are so central to John? Why is that not the Jesus of Mark, Matthew, and Luke?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that the earlier Gospels are really highlighting more of the Jewish fulfillment of Jesus. Matthew presents Jesus as the fulfillment of Jewish expectations, particularly in fulfilling the Davidic reign, as well as Jesus being the new Moses, right? Jesus and Moses both come from Egypt when they're children. Moses crosses the Red Sea. Jesus is baptized in the Jordan River. Moses is in the wilderness for 40 years, and Jesus is in the wilderness for 40 days. Moses receives the law on a mountain. Jesus gives the law from the mountain. And so this is very impactful to the early Jewish community. And that's why it sounds like that.
I think that certainly John is not engaged in the same project of messianic prophecy that Matthew is to the same degree. But all of the canonical gospel writers are doing this project in some sense. Even Matthew doesn't come up with it. You can open the Gospel of Mark, and right when you start, there's a quote from Isaiah waiting for you about voice crying out in the wilderness, John the Baptist type stuff. So John, I think, is rather continuous with that tradition. I would say that I think there are reasons for believing, for one thing, that John has a different audience somewhat, or a different extraction might even be the better way to put it, than Matthew. It's clear that they don't see exactly eye to eye on some kind of fundamental questions. Matthew historically, and this can be kind of attenuated a little bit, but it's understood as having something like a Jewish Christian viewpoint. Again, this is a much more complicated issue in Matthean studies, but I will say that John definitely has a different kind of approach to Jews and Judaism. And I think he regularly speaks about Jews and Judaism as an outsider. I think it wouldn't be surprising even to think of him potentially as a Gentile author if someone deeply anchored in a Jewish matrix, the way that many readers of Paul might have been Gentile in the 2nd century, but also knew a lot about Judaism.
How do you square that with John's emphasis on Jesus as a Passover lamb?
Yeah, Paul has Christ, our Passover is sacrificed. I think to be a legible Christian in the late first and early second century, you had to speak some Judaism. You had to know that tradition pretty deeply. And it's very clear that individuals who are linked up to this movement are reading Jewish scriptures or having them read to them at the very least. So it's not hard to imagine. I don't have to insist on the ethnicity of John's author. What I do have to say, though, is that I think it's clear that they come from somewhat different extractions. And when you open the Gospel of John and he's constantly saying things like glossing, and on the Jewish feast of the Passover, and on the Jewish, this Jewish feast. And when he talks about the burial and talks about the Jewish practices around burial, it's very clear, I think, in a way that's reminiscent of Mark chapter 7, that this author thinks he has to gloss some of this Jewish stuff for his readers in ways that suggest that his audience is probably not Matthew, who is not prone to doing that kind of thing.
His motivation is he's trying to hit a home run. And so John, like you said, Lenny, I think you're correct. He has a broader audience in people who are already, interested in the church community. There's a church community being established. And so he's going to capitalize on that audience in a different way than the previous gospel authors are.
Yeah, I think that there are really complex questions around, for instance, how do you understand and weigh different church traditions? How do we deal with the, uniformity of the attribution to John in the sources that we still have, which are admittedly few and far between? We only have a very fragmentary kind of portrait of what's going on in the second century. But I think that we need to be far more cautious and far more restrained when we work with our historical sources. The fun of apologists is that they had the answer already. They know what happened. And so therefore, they can just launch into the evidence and launch out grabbing whatever they need. The work of a historian is to pick through all of these sources, weigh different factors, recognize that some things don't bend our particular way, and even confront some very uncomfortable conclusions about what this might mean. So I have a Christian identity, and, that's something where what I can't let it do is I can't let it give me the answer before I've even posed the question. I have to be able to work with these texts inductively. I have to think about the complexities and the weaknesses and limitations of the data that I have. And I think that's the fundamental difference between the apologist exercise and the historians, irrespective of faith commitment.
Wes, this has been really good, very helpful. Before we sign off, where can people who watch this video find your ministry?
Nobody's asked that now after Carson and Rogan. Just exist in the world, and Wes Huff will start speaking to you when you least expect it. But on a more pleasant note, let's talk about your new course.
Yeah, so the course is called The New Testament Exploring the Christian Bible. And what we'll be doing in 27 lessons is going through the entire New Testament through the eyes of contemporary critical scholarship. This is the course that I teach at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill to my undergraduates. This is the course that I train my graduate students here, our PhD students, to teach one day. This is a chance for you to enter into the classroom to see how one of the authors of the #1 best-selling textbook in the United States actually conducts a course in the New Testament. And the goal here is to get a sense for how scholars think through issues. Scholars in kind of critical modes of engagement with the Bible can look like hardened skeptics or things like that. I mean, these are the ways I think that they're often caricatured when the exercise is really a much finer, more nuanced, more patient one. And I think part of what I try to do in the course is to teach students how to think critically with the sources that we use to shed light on the Bible, with the Bible itself, to think about all the interpretive options that the Bible gives us. We deal with the really kind of nitty-gritty questions of how do we know anything about history? Can we even trust this? This may lead us to uncomfortable places at times. Kind of one simple fact that's, I think, definitely uncomfortable is the fact that, by my estimate, certainly in the estimate of many people in this field, something around half of this literature is falsely authored. It's if you will, forged. It's pseudepigraphal. And so how do you address that? Why do we think that that's the case to scholars? How do we approach what that means for various kinds of questions we might ask about history, about literature? And so this is a course that I think is there to introduce people to that mode of engaging the Bible. I'm really excited to do it. I think it's a great opportunity and looking forward to it.
Now, am I right in thinking that there's not exams, right? But there is chances for interaction with you?
Yeah, so, the lectures last about 50 minutes. And then I think the real fun of it is the fact that there will be a 15-minute Q&A after each session. And this is something that I don't even have with my students here at Chapel Hill. When I teach the New Testament, I teach it to lecture halls of 240 students. I don't get the entire parade of hands at the end. And so that's really this kind of unique opportunity to have this actually really unprecedented level of access to the professor for something like a large lecture course. We do have quizzes and other sorts of activities. I kind of also offer suggested readings regularly. I give throughout the class also, kind of chapters of my own textbook. If you wanted to use that, you don't have to, but that could be a resource. And so there are ways in which, especially in this Bart Ehrman Biblical Studies Academy universe, they're building community, they're building structure, they have chat forums open for people to discuss these things. It's a really great kind of setup.
I hang out there and it's fun. Now, you mentioned this is part of the Bart Ehrman cinematic universe here that we're part of.
The MCU.
That's right. You've co-written a book with Bart. You teach at the same school as Bart. You're on his platform here. Does this mean that you and Bart are lockstep on all these things? Are you basically just teaching Bart Ehrman?
No. There are definitely differences. The one thing where our differences never matter actually is the difference in our confessional identities or anything. Bart is known as an atheist. I identify as Greek Catholic, although that's always kind of nuanced. But I think as biblical scholars, the exercise always is confession isn't the point. The point is evidence. The point is argument. Can you actually prove your point? And are you open-minded enough to consider all the points, right? I think that's the difference between, fundamentally critical scholars and ones that are more confessionally conservatively anchored. The places where Bart and I argue, though, are plenty, and we argue hard about them. In fact, Bart in high school was a debate team person. I mean, that guy loves to argue. So, for us, I think some of the differences are, Bart is someone who believes very strongly in the existence of a Q source behind the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. I'm fairer hypothesis. I think that Matthew used Luke. So I'm in agreement there with Mark Goodacre. And so part of this class is we're going to tease out the differences between these views. I will say that when I edited the textbook, I told Bart I'd only sign up if he'd let me expand the textbook to include both views, which weren't represented in previous editions, in part because of just a pedagogical choice, right? What might students want to take on at a particular time? I think some of our views on some authorship issues might be different. I think there are some ways that we assemble some questions about the historical Jesus that are probably a little different. But yeah, the reality of biblical scholars disagree. We have different takes, and we actually really enjoy the disagreements.
Well, if anyone's interested in this class, there are two great options. There's a heavily discounted price for the semester as a standalone, but you've also got until the end of the month to sign up for a free trial of the Bart Ehrman Biblical Studies Academy. And included with that is Hugo's course and a load of other courses we've talked about on this channel before. If you've ever been curious if this kind of thing's for you, this is your chance to check it out at no upfront cost, which is a pretty great deal.
I'll say this, I went to a small fundamentalist Christian college. I have the kind of background that I think a lot of people who still have interests and pathologies associated with the Bible, have gone through. And I remember how much I didn't enjoy my little fundamentalist Christian New Testament course. I took it for 2 semesters, and it's a miracle I'm a New Testament scholar today. It was perfectly boring. It was, we know exactly what this text means, we know exactly who wrote it, and we know exactly what it's trying to do. It's trying to do exactly what our theology says it's been trying to do because our founders were next to infallible. And, the fun of biblical studies for me, biblical studies only came alive when I realized we barely know anything about all this. And the fun of it is just actually getting into the evidence and data and arguing and putting together the best cases for things and then backing off sometimes and finding a little more light than heat at the end of that process. I think there has been ways in which biblical scholarship very clearly has taken us forward in our understanding of the Bible over the last several hundred years beyond where we were, for instance, at the end of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance period. I have this kind of really strong passion to share a lot of what biblical studies has to offer individuals just as a teacher. It's very central to my teaching.
Well, that's a great place to end it. Thank you so much, Dr. Méndez, for sharing your insights with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And now you can look forward to having less Huff fans angry at you.
Thanks.
For more looking at the claims of Christians, tap on the video on screen now, and I'll see you over there. Until next time. Later.